Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'm doing a VR to Mags Black of my top 5 sharpshooters and my top 5 deep divers. Now, Mags did this tag as 2 separate tags, one for each of the different sections, but I'm just gonna put them together in one VR because I wanna make sure that I get to both of them. If you haven't yet checked out Mags's channel, definitely go check that out. She's one of my favorite tarot tubers, and I always come away feeling really inspired. So go and check her out. But first, let's take a look at my top 5 sharpshooters. So these are the top 5 tarot decks for quick and clear readings. Now, when I was going through my collection and trying to determine which decks I wanted to include, which actually wasn't as big of a challenge for the sharpshooters as it was for the deep divers, I did only pull decks that I've had for quite some time in my collection. So these are decks that are proven sharpshooters, right? I've had them for a long time. They are proven readers for me. So of course, you'll not be surprised to see my Llewellyn top among that as my probably most quick and clear sharpshooting deck. And part of that is just because I know this deck so well that it really doesn't leave me struggling for messages. I use it almost daily, and so it's definitely one that I'm super connected to, that I really have a deep relationship with it as well. But it's not really like a deep diver, and we'll see kind of maybe a little bit of the difference between this and those when we get to those decks. But for this one, it's just such a clear and easy reader for me. I don't struggle with it. I know the images like the back of my hand, and it always gives me really clear, straightforward readings. And yeah, it's just beautiful. I love working with it. And of course, it's one of the decks that's like on my desk at hand at all times. So I definitely make use of it quite often, especially for really quick readings. This is a great one for just a single card pull or a real quick 3-card reading on the fly. I do occasionally use it for larger readings for deeper issues, but for the most part, it is just a clear and simple sharpshooting deck for me. So my next sharpshooter deck is the Green Witch Tarot. And again, this is another one that I've had in my collection for a very long time. And it really is kind of like a trusted friend in that I can go to this deck at any time and know I'm just gonna kind of get that friendly advice, but in a really quick and clear manner. Again, it's a deck that I don't struggle with the interpretations. I don't struggle with the images. I know this deck really well. I've used it for quite a long time. It is kind of my main sort of witchy deck that I use, or my main, a lot of times my main seasonal deck, because this deck also has a lot of seasonal energy for me. But this deck, as I've mentioned many, many times, feels like a deck of old friends. I feel like these are energies and people in this deck that I can just come to and say, here's what's going on, and they will give me a nice, clear, often friendly message. I wouldn't say it's like a hug deck in the sense that it only gives, positive messages. For me, I do find that this deck will call me out when it needs to, but it definitely does kind of approach it as sort of a friend giving you advice, right? It's still very to the point, it's still very clear, but it's delivered with a bit of compassion, a little bit of sympathy, and I do really appreciate this deck for that. It's one that I use quite often and work with all the time, and again, it's just another kind of classic sharpshooter deck in my collection. So another deck that I often go to for really quick and clear readings is my Dreaming Way Tarot. This one I have trimmed. Of course, my Llewellyn is modified. This deck, again, is just full of really clear, very to the point messages for me. It really does kind of represent the RWS structure in a really kind of approachable and beautiful way. It feels a little bit modern in some of the depictions, but not so modern that it feels unapproachable, or that I feel disconnected from, as I sometimes do with really, really modern decks. It just feels very kind of friendly, very approachable, but it also is very to the point for me. I get very succinct readings, very quick, easy, clear. This is definitely a deck that I come to whenever I just, no muss, no fuss, just want a reading. I just want a clear message, and this is definitely the deck that I go to for it. Again, another deck that I don't struggle with the imagery or the messages. Another one that I've had in my collection for a very long time, and so I always enjoy pulling it out whenever I need a quick and easy reading. So a deck that I haven't had as long as the rest of these, but has become a very clear reader for me is, of course, the Morgan Greer. Now this one I got, I want to say a year or so ago, maybe a little bit more now. And it was kind of part of a whole thing I did where I was trying to connect with some of these sort of vintage decks that I hadn't ever connected with, like really those really classic Rider-Waite-Smiths. I did a whole video on it. I bought several of the decks. 2 of them are still in my collection, this one and the Aquarian. This is the one that I use the most. I've mentioned a lot of times this deck definitely has a paternal energy to me. And it feels very much rooted in my family life, as in my extended family life. It feels very connected to family type energy and family type readings. But again, very clear, very quick and easy reader, because these images are just so familiar that I think I kind of had that connection with it right from the get-go. It definitely wasn't one that I've ever struggled with to read with it, and I think that's because it is so Rider-Waite-Smith, right? It's so ingrained in that structure that it's just a real quick and easy reader for me. The Smith-Waite Centennial could have also been in here, but I don't use that one near as much as I use these ones. So this is definitely one of my favorite clear sharpshooter decks when I just want a quick and easy reading. I do also have this one in the tin, and that one actually lives in my living room most of the time. So this deck gets used a lot for really quick, kind of those quick fire, simple readings. I use this deck all the time for that. So my last sharpshooter deck is my Anna.K. Now this is my full size one. I do have a modified version that I trimmed down to be the same size as the Llewellyn, because I do read with them together quite frequently. One of the things I love about this deck, it is totally devoid of any sort of esoterica. So it feels very much in the mundane everyday world. And in that way, I feel like the messages are really, really clear. The guidance is very straightforward and to the point. This is often the deck that I go to for readings that have to do with my immediate family. You know, me and my husband and my kids. It's a deck that I go to a lot when I have questions, when I need guidance, because it's always very clear, very to the point, and it feels kind of very grounded in the everyday mundane. And I think for that, it really does make it a sharpshooter, because it's one that I can just go, pull a couple cards, see what's going on, do my little reading, and I can walk away with a message pretty quick and easy, and it's not something that I struggle with. I do really love the faces in this deck. I'll be honest, they turned me off at first, but I've grown very fond of them. I know that's a turnoff for a lot of people, but there's just so much expression in these faces that I've really grown quite fond of them all. They feel like friends. They feel like a part of my family. So this is definitely a deck that I use for quick, clear, easy readings. It is a no muss, no fuss deck, and I really enjoy working with it. All right, so I am gonna cheat real quick, because I am gonna throw in one bonus deck for each of these 2 categories, or each of these 2 tags, because I do have 2 decks that immediately came to mind, one for each, that really hit this energy for me, but I haven't had them long enough to really say if it's a long-term connection there in terms of how I work with them. This is the Northern Animal Tarot. It is the first edition. I talked about this deck at length in December and January. It's been a deck that I've really been surprised by, and it is a super, super quick and easy, clear reader for me. I do not struggle with this deck at all, which is unusual, because animal decks for me are usually an issue. I struggle with them. But because these are maybe anthropomorphized animals, I don't have any sort of struggle with them. I just see them as kind of like, they're like little people, they're animal people. And so I'm able to connect with it really easily. I didn't include it as one of my 5 because I've only had it for a couple months, and I don't feel like I'm really can say that it's for the long term gonna always be a real quick and easy sharpshooter, because again, I haven't had it for that long, but I do feel like it's probably gonna earn its place in that in that space in my collection. So I did just want to mention it as a bonus, but again, because I haven't had it for years, like I have these, I didn't feel like it really has quite earned its spot yet, but it's headed there. So the next tag was my top 5 deep divers, and this is 5 tarot decks for deep personal work. This category was really hard for me to actually just narrow it down to 5 decks because that is a lot of what I do with my tarot. But I did try to, again, pick 5 decks that have been very consistent for me and have really kind of proven their place in my practice for deep work. So the first deck is the Tarot de St. Croix, and this is a deck that I consider kind of my personal path deck. It's the deck that I use most often when I am doing work that relates to my personal journey through life. So personal growth, awareness, development, a little bit of spirituality, although I do have another deck for that kind of category. This deck is just such a wonderful representation of that energy for me. It's just a wonderful kind of all around type of deck, and I think it really represents the kind of work that I do in that way, like on a personal level. It really represents it beautifully. So I love that it kind of bridges that gap for me. It has a little bit of everything in here, which is kind of how I feel like my personal path is. It's a little bit eclectic. It's a little bit of this from this area, a little bit of that from that area. And I kind of just mix it all together into this little like practice soup that is just kind of my own unique thing, and doesn't really adhere to one particular tradition or another. And I feel like this deck actually represents that beautifully. It's a little bit of everything all rolled into one. And did anybody else just hear the Meredith Brooks song in the back of their head? Because I did. I really love working with this deck in terms of tapping into that energy and working through my own personal path, and that's definitely the deck that I tend to use the most often for that. This is the newer Borderless edition. I do have the first edition as well, so it's definitely a deep diver for when it comes to working on my personal path. So similar to that, we have the Animals Divine, which is the deck that for me really represents my spiritual path. And I use this deck a lot for connecting with that energy. I've shown it many times before. It is very sadly out of print. I do hope that this deck will either come back as mass market or even as an indie deck from Lisa Hunt. I know she's talked about releasing some of her other decks, so maybe this one will. I think I heard at one point somebody had posted on our Facebook group, and somebody, an admin or something, had responded that it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. So fingers crossed that is the case. I would definitely get a backup copy of this deck if it became available again. This deck to me really beautifully represents the kind of as above, so below energy. We have the gods and goddesses in the quartz and the majors, and then in the minors we have animals. And this is the deck that really helped me kind of come to terms with working with animal energy a little bit. I still find it easiest in this deck to work with kind of traditional animal energy than any other. But this deck really does help me kind of dive into my spiritual path. I use it a lot for very deep spiritual readings. I use it a lot with deity work, with connecting to universe, cosmos, all of that kind of good stuff. It just kind of captures it all for me and really encompasses that energy beautifully. And it's one I, again, use all the time for those kind of readings. Definitely a deep diver when it comes to doing spiritual work for me. So kind of moving away from the spiritual into more of the kind of nitty gritty of kind of everyday. This is the Black Lily Tarot, and I chose this one, Nudity Alert, just so you know. This deck for me is a deep diver because I use it a lot for personal growth work, particularly in terms of self-acceptance. So this deck, I call it my inner truth teller most of the time, because this deck will tell me like it is. It does not sugarcoat it. I feel like this is my inner voice saying, quit goofing around. This is what you need to know. And I'm not gonna say it nicely. Deal with it. And it's like a kick in the butt. And I need that a lot of times. And this is a deck that has been really wonderful for helping me kind of work towards self-acceptance, to tap into inner power in that sense. It's definitely got a lot of raw energy to it that I appreciate. And it's one that I use for a variety of different things. It often comes out in my new moon readings. It often comes out in things that other people might consider shadow work. It's one that I use a lot in those kind of readings as well. But it's also one that really just kind of represents my inner truth teller. So, you know, that part of you that can't lie to yourself. That is what this deck does. And I use it a lot for really deep kind of personal growth work in that sense. And I love it. I love its kind of brutal energy. It really kicks my butt when I need it to, and it doesn't sugarcoat it, and it doesn't pull any punches, and I appreciate its rawness and its honesty. So again, another deep diver for personal work, because this is the one that I kind of use for, I guess, what some people would call shadow work. That's probably what you would consider it. So another deck that I use in kind of the same way for deep personal work is the Nicoletta Ceccoli. Now I have severely, is that the right way? I have very creatively, let's put it that way, I have modified the heck out of this deck. I have rebacked it in black contact paper. I have edged it, of course. I have trimmed it. I have restructured the entire deck. I have a video on how I did that, and I did actually replace one of the cards as well. I printed off my own. But anyway, this deck is kind of like my really, really deep healing deck in terms of, again, sort of like the Black Lily, it's gonna pull things out that maybe I wouldn't necessarily wanna face. I also tend to call this deck my Wounded Inner Child deck because it's definitely a deck that I go to for that type of work as well, kind of trying to heal the wounded inner child that we all carry around inside of us, and this deck for me works beautifully for it. I do read this deck very intuitively, although I have created a whole new structure, and I kind of like made my own guidebook and like did a whole thing with it, which I think was very key to my bonding with this deck and creating a sort of language that I could work with specifically, you know, and very personally tied into me and my work with this particular deck. But it's one that I use for really deep inner healing, inner child healing work, specifically working with the wounded inner child. This was the card that kind of inspired the whole thing for me. So anyway, I love working with this deck. There is just so much in this deck. It's not one that I would recommend for beginners, I'll be perfectly honest, and I feel like you have to be in the right headspace and willing to do the work to get into this deck, but that just could be my experience with it. But it's definitely a very, very deep diver for me in terms of that kind of personal work. Again, maybe you might call it some sort of shadow work, whereas this one feels very much where I am now. This one feels very much tapped into, again, that inner child, maybe even some past life work, although I'm not an expert in that in any shape or form, but there's just something about this deck that really taps into that kind of energy for me, and I use it for that very deep work. So my last deep diver deck for personal work is the Lioness Tarot Oracle. This is one, again, that I spoke about quite a bit at the end of 2020. I think I even did, I know I did a video that wasn't about this deck, but was kind of inspired by this deck. It was the All That Mattered video. And this deck is my deep diver for healing work, particularly healing around my creative life, my creative energy, my creative efforts. It's definitely like what I consider my Leo deck. It definitely has that energy, of course, with all the big cats. When I got this deck, I got it because I discovered that I have a lot of Leo in my chart. It is both my rising and my moon sign. And I was looking for a deck that would help me connect with that energy. And so I purchased this one to help me with that work. I was not expecting it to be such the deep deck for me in terms of my creativity work, in terms of my healing journey. It's just been one that I have done a lot of really deep work tied into kind of where I'm at and what I'm creating in the world today. It feels very much a part of where I am now. I don't know if it will always be a deep diver because it does feel so attuned to what's going on in my life and my place in my life at this point. I don't know if in 10 years I'll still feel that way, but for right now, this is the deck that I am using for pretty much any sort of deep work that has to do with healing, and particularly with healing and exploring and expanding and understanding my own creative self. Again, really tied into my Leo self for me. So this deck has been one that pretty much hasn't left my table since I got it either. I have purchased one of her Oracle decks now, so I'm really, really enjoying working with this one. But it's also one that really has a lot of depth for me and really does help me kind of connect to that part of my practice and that part of my inner work. And again, I'm going to cheat and throw a bonus one in there. And this, I'm sure, as you recognize, is the Thoth Tarot. This deck, I feel like is going to become a deep diver for deep personal work at some point. I really feel like it's going that way. It's one that I'm definitely diving into currently. It's one that I'm working on getting to know. I started this process last year, and this year I'm really diving even further into it. I'm studying the deck. I'm studying all the associations along with it. I pull a card every single day. It's been definitely a huge part of my tarot practice and my tarot work. So it would be a deep personal deck for my learning tarot. And I wanted to include it because I do feel like it's got weight, it's got depth. It blows me away every time I get it out. And I'm really learning a lot from this deck, and I feel like this is going to be one that really ties into deep work for me. But right now it's still too new to say for sure whether or not it will be that for the long term. But for right now, I'm definitely feeling the deep dive, deep personal work energy from this deck. So there we go. Those are my top 5 sharpshooters and my top 5 deep divers of VR to Mags Black. As I mentioned, if you haven't checked out Mags's channel, definitely go check her out. I really enjoy her content, and it was really fun to go through my collection and look at what my sharpshooters and my deep divers are. As always, my friends, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.